Penguin Random House Audio presents The Equivalents, a story of art, female friendship, and liberation in the 1960s, by Maggie Doherty, read for you by Rebecca Lowman. Introduction. The poet Anne Sexton spent the summer of 1962 swimming. Months away from publishing her second book and poised on the edge of fame, she soothed her nerves with water. When the weather was warm enough for a dip, she would step out of her house, strip nude, and slide into the pool in her backyard. She delighted in the warmth of the sun, the smooth feel of the water, the quiet of the morning. She could see an old train track from her backyard, while just out of sight, beyond the old rolling hills of a golf course, the Charles River flowed through Newton Lower Falls, wending its way to the harbor in Boston. Sexton's young daughters, Joy and Linda, didn't like when their mom skinny dipped. But the kids were often absent that summer, off with a babysitter or with Sexton's mother-in-law, who frequently helped with childcare. Sexton needed the time to work. Though she'd only started writing poetry seriously 5.5 years earlier on a whim, her first collection had been a critical success. Fellow poets respected her. Some of them expected great things. Sexton was a natural performer, an elegant woman with long legs and slim hips. She captivated audiences at her readings. But she was also a labile, anxious woman, and she frequently needed time off from mothering simply to relax. On these summer mornings, she would swim calmly from one end of her pool to the other, traversing its 25-foot length. Poetry usually followed her ritual sun worship. She would experiment with new poems, tinker with old ones, write a letter or two. One of her major projects that summer was reviewing the galleys for her next collection of poetry. The book, her second, was to be published by Houghton Mifflin in October. The esteemed poet Robert Lowell, her friend and former teacher, had already agreed to let her quote some of his words of praise. If she were so inclined, she could drive into Cambridge's Harvard Square and review the galleys in a gabled house where she and 23 other women created, studied, and worked, each with her own small office. But most days, Sexton found it more comfortable to work at home, especially now that she could, to her husband's relief, work somewhere other than the dining room table. Her home study had been built the previous summer. She described it to a friend as a wooden tower standing where the porch had once been. It had one long window that faced the backyard. Looking out, Sexton could see the pine trees and the blue hills from her desk, but when she was writing, she faced away from the window. "Nature becomes my enemy," she explained. While working, she sat either in her straight desk chair or, more often, in a soft red chair with her feet perched on one of her many bookcases. She could spend hours sitting in this position, drawing inspiration from the great writers on the shelves, many of whom she'd encountered only recently, Kafka, Rilke, Dostoevsky, and many of whom she'd come to love. "I hoard books," she once confessed to a friend. "They are people who do not leave." There was another advantage to working from home. Sexton lived just a few minutes' drive from her best friend, the poet Maxine Kumin. Tall, lean, and dark-haired, Kumin could seem at first to be Sexton's twin, until one noticed her athletic build, her slightly hooded eyes, the sharp angles of her face. She, too, was a suburban mother and the author of a published book of poetry. She was also Sexton's main source of emotional and creative support. In the early 1960s, the poets' lives were enmeshed. They spoke on the phone every day, sometimes about writing, sometimes simply about their lives. They watched each other's children. They served cocktails to each other's husbands. After Sexton installed her pool, the friends developed a happy routine that blended work and play. Kumin brought her children over to swim, and she and Sexton sat by the edge of the pool with typewriters in their laps, their legs dangling in the water, and worked together on a children's book, a nice break from their adult compositions. Though Sexton often feared social gatherings, Kumin's dependable, comfortable company was almost always welcome. But in the mornings, Kumin was usually still at her own home, caring for her own children. Sexton was left to appreciate her solitude. On these summer mornings, no one needed her, not her husband, not her children, not her mother-in-law, not even her friend. The day was beautifully, blissfully hers. Everything about these summer days, the pool, the study, the solitude, the second book, the second place to write, even the companionship of Kumin, was the product of a novel experiment in women's higher education. In the fall of 1960, the prestigious women's college Radcliffe, the sister school of Harvard, had announced an unprecedented fellowship program, one that targeted a ubiquitous and yet marginalized class of Americans, mothers. In the words of its founder, the Radcliffe president and microbiologist Mary Ingram Bunting, the Radcliffe Institute for Independent Study was designed to combat the climate of unexpectation facing women in mid-century America. As she saw it, too many accomplished female undergraduates were giving up their dreams of becoming scholars or artists because they couldn't see how they could do research or write a book while also managing a family and keeping house. The new program proposed to get these intellectually displaced women back on track. Each woman admitted to the Institute as an associate scholar received a stipend of up to $3,000, nearly $25,000 today, to spend as she pleased. She also received access to Harvard's library resources and a private office, the proverbial room of her own, in a little yellow house at 78 Mount Auburn Street, just a few blocks from Harvard Yard. A mother of 4 children, Bunting believed that most women wanted to find a way to combine professional interests and family life. Her own happiest years had been those she spent raising her children on a small farm in Connecticut, while commuting twice a week to do research in a lab at Yale. As a university administrator and education reformer, Bunting recognized the role that institutions played in supporting women's professional ambitions. She realized that you couldn't simply tell women to work hard and keep studying if the world didn't give them the tools and resources to do so. The Institute's founding had been announced on November 19, 1960. A New York Times article broadcast the news to the nation. Radcliffe pioneers in plan for gifted women's study. Almost immediately, the phone in Bunting's office rang nonstop. Within 10 days, Bunting's secretary had been inundated with over 160 letters of congratulation and inquiry. Once the application process was formalized, the Institute received nearly 200 applications from women all across the country. Other women interested in applying had been turned away because they didn't have the requisite qualifications. And in September 1961, the Institute offered an inaugural group of 24 remarkable women, including Sexton and Kumin, the resources they needed to succeed: fellowship money, office space, and most important, membership in a professional and creative female community, the likes of which had never been seen before in the country's history. Imagine being a gifted woman like the women accepted to the Institute at the dawn of the 1960s. Perhaps you had graduated from one of the 7 sisters colleges, maybe taken what people called a little job in New York after school. Maybe you even worked for the Allied war effort while your husband served overseas. Not long after the bombs fell on Japan, though, your job prospects dried up. The GIs returned stateside, and they wanted their jobs back, or they wanted spots in graduate school so they could get even better jobs. As the Soviets built their missiles and nuclear destruction loomed, you were told that the best way you could serve your country was to build a happy home. Now, by all accounts, you have the perfect life. You have the high-earning husband, the rosy-cheeked children, and the Buick in the driveway. But something isn't right. Household tasks don't seem to hold your attention. You snarl at your children instead of blanketing them with smiles. You fret about how little you resemble those glossy women in the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?